Hi, I'm Dr. Robbie Lloyd. I'm Community Relationships and Wellbeing Manager at the Mid-North Coast Community College, and we're here to have a look at peer support and mentoring, which is pretty relevant in the time of COVID-19. It's a program that I first came across over 10 years ago when I was working in the Northern Territory, and many remote communities face quite stressful circumstances for their staff. So the school where I was working in Alice Springs asked Michael Tunnicliffe, the psychologist from Perth, to come and run a program for the whole team. And I followed up with a trip to Perth and did the trainer with Michael on his peer support program, which he developed originally as the police psychologist for Western Australia. He was helping colleagues in the police and staff in banks recover from the trauma of being in an armed hold-up. And that became quite a well-known support service. And then he was approached by many other industry sectors, notably mining, construction and forestry, to provide training for teams of people who needed to be there for each other in stressful times. And in the era before COVID-19, we all remember the stress that everybody went through because of the bushfires. So all those folks from bushfires and SES and the police who've been heavily part of supporting the whole community, they need support from one another when they're on the job and off the job. This is where peer support and mentoring really kicks in. And lo and behold, that's really relevant for all of us now, as COVID-19 has created stress right across society, but particularly for those frontline workers who are still operating when many of us are in lockdown and working from home. So this program is about helping everybody come to understand what we mean by peer support and mentoring. So peer support and mentoring are really designed for workplace support situations in stressful incidents. These can be due to accidents or people being upset by customers, and in the current circumstances we know that's a very relevant thing for the retail trade and for people in frontline jobs in Centrelink, other social services, banks and places where the stress of COVID-19 is likely to make the customer really on edge and perhaps having a very bad hair day. So the staff are going to receive a lot of that stress across the counter, and they need to be there in more intentional ways for one another. Mentoring is a different approach. This is very much based on the idea of a more experienced person or even a senior staffer being there to provide what people in psychology and social work worlds called supervision. But it doesn't mean surveillance supervision, it means being there for unconditional positive support for a colleague. And this requires a process of allowing debriefing, offloading, having a whinge, however you like to put it, confidentially, and so that person can get feedback about how they're feeling and how to look at and reflect on the things that have happened to them on their shift. So we'll come to mentoring later, but in the immediate, peer support is not counselling. It's a process of support which is what we might call triaging the situation. A lighter level of support where you're not claiming to be an expert, you're really looking to provide immediate practical support and to be there for the person who's undergoing the stressful situation. Simple feedback and the person knowing that whatever they're sharing with you will be dealt with confidentially, and that you're going to give them relevant practical information in that moment. That's the sort of core of what we're aiming to achieve with the peer support process. This means in what we'd call normal work situations that Peers can help each other diffuse circumstances that might lead to bigger problems down the track, even workers' compensation claims or industrial situations, simply by being there for each other. The stress that creates conflict at work or feelings of rejection in the workplace are often best dealt with by those in the circumstance who understand the context. And this is pretty much the COVID-19 situation. Whatever your context, those around you know that best. And so if they can be there for you doing the immediate support you need without trying to deeply counsel you, that can help everybody get through that circumstance successfully. And of course, this is also very cost effective for employers to have a workforce who are there for each other and not having to call on more expensive supports. It's important to know, if you're going to be involved in peer support, what's required of you. And not everybody's made for this kind of role. So the attributes that I recommend you need to think about if you want to consider becoming a peer supporter are answering these sorts of questions with one of three options. Whether your answer would be, I'm like this rarely, I'm like this sometimes, or I'm usually like this. And if you're usually like this, that means probably you would make a good peer supporter. So things like, I can relax myself when I'm under pressure and help others. I can identify situations that impact my emotions and manage my own self-care. When I'm under pressure, I can help myself change my emotional state to be able to cope, and then I can assist others to calm down. I can accurately reflect someone's feelings back to them. If someone's blaming me or angry at me, I can stay calm. I can talk about negative things without getting upset. In conflict situations, I can help others resolve things. I can listen to people without interrupting them and then summarise what's been said. And I think before acting and always follow through consistently. Those are the sorts of attributes that make a great peer supporter. So when we talk about stress, there are 6 levels of stress that make up what's known as the stress spectrum. The first one we probably all know about, that's self-stress, when we put high demands on ourselves at work or at home, especially for those perfectionists amongst us. Then there's interpersonal stress, which is when we're dealing with other people's attitudes and behaviours, or their beliefs or their personalities, which shows up, as we well know, in our families and in our workplaces. Then there's personal problems creating stress. That could be financial, family issues, relationship issues, health issues. Job stress, everybody pretty much understands the demands and expectations that we feel are being put on us, whether it's real or our perception. Work can be very stressful. 2 other types of stress which are relevant, especially in the COVID era. Critical incident stress, when a sudden unexpected incident creates instant stress, or in the COVID case, prolonged stress, which may not feel immediately critical, but is actually worrying, and when our behaviour needs to be controlled to maintain our safety, that's stressful. And then there's post-traumatic stress. We're not talking about the clinical diagnosis of post-traumatic stress disorder, but about dealing with the memories of a critical incident and how that has affected our thoughts and feelings. And that will probably be the case for a number of people, especially frontline workers, after COVID-19, or as the Prime Minister likes to say, when we get on the other side. So The levels of impact of stress and trauma, crises and coping show up in four main areas. There can be physical reactions like headache, muscle tension, skin rash, shaking, sweating. There are mental reactions like confusion or disorientation. Emotional reactions, anger, worry, anxiety, apprehension. And then behavioural reactions like agitation, disturbed sleep, pacing up and down, or becoming demanding. Those are understandable levels of reaction to stress. So, influences on our reactions to stress in the personal area rely a lot on personality. Are we an introvert, an extrovert? What are our character traits like? Do we open to new ideas? Are we creative in our thinking or very rigid? What's our life experience taught us so far? Have we become fearful because of things that have happened to us before? Or have we learned to cope because we've been through a fair bit of challenging stuff in life? And also, what have we been trained in? Part of the reason for this course is when we train in this kind of awareness, it builds up an ability to cope ourselves and to help others. Then we have the situational factors that influence our reactions to stress, particularly fatigue. So if you're already worn out, you're feeling exhausted, and then a stressful thing happens, you're going to have a much worse reaction than if you were just cruising along and feeling fine. The severity of the incident. So major crashes and disasters, they create high stress, but this is a pretty severe incident we're in with COVID-19 because it's a prolonged stress on the whole of society. Then there's a matter of our control levels. If we have a lack of control over the events in our lives, that really raises the stress. And that's one of the factors here with COVID-19, just as it is in bushfires and for farmers in prolonged drought. When we've got no control, it really does ramp up the stress. And lastly, in appraising the outcomes, our emotional responses are deeply linked to whether we think the outcome of how stress has been handled was successful or unsuccessful. If we think it was a stuff-up, then we're likely to increase our stress response. So with that background, it's good for you to know if you're going to consider becoming a peer support, and especially a mentor, the types of support that you will be expected to provide. And this training, when we go into the detail, will give you much more background on how to be ready for that. But the things that you would be wanting to provide would be practical support, so immediate hands-on ways of helping the situation that you're in right now. Then emotional support, what I call empathy in action. So you're there for the other person. And particularly, you need to be able to be the sort of person who's there without putting yourself in the centre of it. The other person is in the centre of things and you're just an on-the-side supporter showing empathy. Then there's verbal support. Not talking too much, but being able to communicate with unconditionally caring words. Sometimes that's hard because, especially for blokes, we want to get in and say things which we think will solve it all, when really the person really prefers to hear caring words that show you're hearing them. Then there's information support. So what do they need to know that will help them feel that they're getting practical advice? Then there's group support. So we are here for you together. It's very much the Prime Minister's message in the COVID situation, and we want to bring that down into local situations, especially among working teams who are under high stress. Then there's supervisory support. So supervisors who can provide open, supportive listening and allow the debriefing and reflection that leads to greater learning to be able to handle things better next time. And lastly, the professional support, what I call clinicians can go deeper. That's not what peer support is about, but we can definitely be the conduit, the guide into that if that is needed, which is, not always the case, but there will be circumstances where that needs to be the case to refer on for deeper professional support. So the core elements of peer support are to understand your role, to be able to be problem solving without taking over the person or calling yourself the expert, to be a resource for information, to guarantee confidentiality so the person feels safe, and lastly, communication skill, listening most important of all. Then we have the two types of support, reactive and proactive. So reactive is when you're responding to an approach from someone asking for help due to the stress they're under. And proactive is when you notice that someone's got a problem and you intervene to offer support. And there are 12 essential things that you'll become familiar with when you've been involved a few times, but you've got to have available time or make the time. Stop doing what you're doing and be there. You've got to have goodwill, so don't get into this if it's going to annoy you. You've got to be willing to do it and feel free to do it. Understanding is really important. That's what the person needs to feel, that you're understanding what they're experiencing. You need to be able to focus. So you've got to be on the job and sharply focused on what someone else needs. Objectivity is essential. So no judgment. You just remain objective about, I'm here to help this person get through this moment. You need to have good rapport. So if that's not your bag, then this probably isn't for you. Confidentiality. No talking about it afterwards. What happens here stays here. Empathy. Warmth and caring listening is the critical factor. Sensitivity, so that you can show you've got the ability to really understand what someone else is going through. Appropriate self-disclosure is very important for you to be able to communicate that you know how someone else feels, you may have been through something similar. You don't have to unpack a whole of your life story, but just to communicate quickly that you know what they're talking about because you might have been through something similar. Then effective communication. Keep it short, keep it simple, make it caring. And then having knowledge about information and resources that will help the person with the practical stuff. They're the essentials that we'll go into in much more detail. But if this is appealing to you, then I think that's the moment where you might decide, yep, I'm ready to sign up. So you're a problem solver in peer support, and the 5 aspects of problem solving, we call it the problem solving pentagon. This is what you're doing as you assess inside your own head, what am I dealing with here? Define the problem. Secondly, consider the options. So this could be even before you act to support the person. What are my options? What are this person's options? Then select the best option, which could be in the conversation with the person once you've started to open up the support process, or you might have had a decision before you go to them about what an option is for them to consider first, but always be open to changing according to what the person says they need. Then you take action. you step in and begin this process of interacting with the person. And then once you've taken action, you evaluate the outcome. How did that go? What did it feel like for them and for me? So the three questions I ask myself in this process, whether it's before we interact or during, who needs what, who owns the problem, and who has the power. That could be about the person who is feeling the problem, the person who is behind the problem, or a whole network of people who are part of the problem. Next comes the group support process. And this is where you bring people together to give them information, to defuse the stress, and to help by debriefing from the stress. This will be very important in the COVID situation for teams of people who are dealing with pretty scratchy customers. I imagine the Centrelink staff and many people in the retail trade would be feeling this. So we call it the 5F method of group support, just as a quick summary of what gets us through this process. Focus, facts, feelings, fitting it together, and future. So how do we define the problem? What's happening here? Who's feeling what? How are we going to piece together the solution? And what's that going to lead to in the future? So when you need to refer for specialised help, that's okay. You need to be able to call it inside your own head. This person needs somebody who's going to go deeper. So you help them with the immediate situation and then refer on. So you need to know how to do that. If it's a work situation, most workplaces have an employee assistance program, and many community organisations use that EAP system as well. So those counsellors can deal with severe stress and critical incident reactions. They can help people develop their own self-management, their coping strategies, or they may even need clinical intervention and a prescription of some medicine. If there's escalated signs and symptoms with the people you're dealing with, you definitely need to get outside help. And to become a peer supporter, you need to know where to go to get that outside help. So that's part of what you set up in the circumstances that we'll be talking about more deeply in the course. Just to run through the roles and responsibilities, this is to help you decide, is this for me? You need to be able to give people time to express their feelings. You need to be able to appreciate that some people don't express their feelings openly. They might be very introverted, shy, or frightened of expressing feelings because of previous experiences in their family life. They may have been in traumatic situations. If they've come through a refugee experience, we never know. But your typical reaction needs to be reassuring. That's your default position, to be a listening ear, unconditionally caring and reassuring, but objective. You need to be able to give information that they can understand, and if necessary, help them with the links for counselling if they need to go deeper. You also need to be able to think about checking with their network for ongoing support at home. So what's the family situation? What's the friend's situation? What's their neighbourhood like? And then you need to be able to review the coping strategies with people for the immediate period of the next 12 to 24 hours. So where are you going to go next? Who's going to be there? Who's going to be with you tonight? What's going to happen tomorrow? That type of approach. And then it's your responsibility to follow up, check in, monitor what's happened, and record the outcomes. That's the job of a peer supporter. So in summary, we have the don't be late, LATE. L is for listen to the person under stress and give them a chance to diffuse their emotions. Give time to drain off the emotions. A is for acknowledge what they're saying. That doesn't mean you agree with them, it means you're hearing them. T is for talk about options and assist them to engage with problem-solving strategies which they can manage, not something which they can't manage. So you need to understand who you're dealing with. And then E is for encourage them to take some action, or at least seek out professional advice if you feel that's what's needed. So this is where you really need to understand who you're dealing with and what's their circumstance, and you need to be able to be objective enough to give the feedback that says that's not going to cut it if you know they need to take a different action. In the COVID circumstances, we're going to be often talking about virtual peer support. So this is another matter where online empathy needs to be associated with practicality. You don't want to just do what many people tell me happens to their aging parents when they're told by somebody in the system, oh, just go to the My Aged Care website. It's all there for you. Don't refer to websites or online support unless you know it's relevant, active, available, and empathetic. There's no point going to a website that's going to scare people and confuse them and intimidate them. You've got to make sure that people have the technology and the internet access and the ability to use it if you're going to get them to look for virtual support. And you need it to be live online and engaging with people, not just going through a static checklist. These guys need practical listening, reactive help. And also people's perception of their control over what happens needs to be reassured and the confidentiality aspect guaranteed. So often the online world feels quite daunting for people in those aspects. And wherever possible, link it to local support services so that follow-up can be deeper for people as soon as possible. Supporting family and friends is also important, and parents, carers, they understand the whole context. So checking in virtually, who's there with you at home, who are you looking after, what's the background, cultural, socio-economic, is there conflict there, and checking for any triggering issues like have there been uniformed police or SES or people involved who might frighten people who've come from refugee backgrounds. Another group is vulnerable people. I have a lot to do with people with intellectual disability and mental health challenges. I have a number of people in my family in this bracket. These guys have special needs for empathy and listening, and so do people from multicultural backgrounds, Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander backgrounds, where there's been so much trauma across the generations, and the LGBTQI diverse population, they have great sensitivity. So the circumstances of these groups really determine a lot of what kind of virtual support is relevant. Now about mentoring. It's different to peer support, but peers can be mentors. Normally, that would be somebody who has more experience and feels perhaps they're more mature in the circumstance. The main thing about mentors is that they meet with their mentees regularly. It's all about forming a relationship of trust with a person who can be objective and give you helpful feedback and input that facilitates your growth. I call it informing reflective practice to help us think about how am I going with what I'm doing and how am I growing with how I respond to my own feelings and experiences in these circumstances, particularly relevant in the stress of the COVID-19. So mentors need to be clear and focused in guiding a two-way conversation. It's a process of careful listening and sharing where the mentee feels safe and supported, even if some of the feedback is a little bit tough, where they might need to grow and engage in some reflection on how they've been approaching things. Mentors are involved. They are able to share their time. They're able to give advice and share their feelings openly and honestly. That's not always easy. You might have had a bad hair day and find yourself mentoring someone and their problem seems very small compared to what you've just been through. But you need to be able to put that behind you and focus on the needs of the person you're mentoring. Mentoring is intentional and planned guidance. The relationship between the mentor and mentee is the most critical thing. The chemistry either works or it doesn't. You set a vision and plan together for your growth and development, and you agree on being partners, and I can tell you from my own experience, both sides learn a lot. You check in and debrief regularly, and you follow up on patterns of weaker choices, and you celebrate achievements, so progress is noted. Mentors express trust and confidence, and they encourage risk-taking by their mentees. So have a go at it. If it doesn't work, you'll have another shot next time. And remember, everything is a learning experience. Keep repeating this cycle of mentor support. It's a very strong process. So that's the two elements of the peer support and mentoring, and we'll go into much more detail in the full course. I hope you decide to join us. Thanks.